Thanks, everybody. Welcome to Build. I'm your host, Ricky Camilleri. Arthur Miller is arguably the greatest American playwright to have lived, and his daughter, Rebecca Miller, a truly great storyteller in her own right, has teamed with producer Damon Cardasis to tell her father's story. Let's take a look at a clip from the documentary Arthur Miller, Writer.
Okay, Pop.
When you start a play, do you start with a character?
A person, a human being.
My father was a national icon decades before I was born.
Giant of the American theater, Arthur Miller.
There was nothing more important than a great play.
I think they felt, oh my God, that's me.
Early on, I recognized that his public persona was so different from the man I knew.
I'm gonna cut up this here chicken.
My perception as I grew up was that you had a lot of disappointments in the theater.
I agree with you, but the voice is the important thing, that you don't go silent.
I'm the guy that goes around and says, well, what is really going on?
I enjoyed being father. I enjoyed also escaping being a father.
Did you get the feeling that Dad had a weak spot for being adored?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Art is long. Life is short. I forgot the Latin.
Everybody, please welcome director Rebecca Miller and producer Damon Cardasis. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Congratulations on capturing your father in such a beautifully told documentary. I know you started shooting this quite some time ago. What made you decide now to get finishing?
Well, it was about 25 years after I sort of started shooting, or at least 20 years, when I realized that I'd amassed all this material, over 200 hours of footage, and it got to a point where I just really felt I had to finish it. My father had died some years ago. I had some distance, and I knew Damon. And Damon was really the key because as my producing partner, I knew that he would be able to put all these elements together into something that I could then work on. It was really intimidating without that organizing force.
How did you step in and become an organizing force? Was it also kind of sort of being able to pick apart and find some of the story threads that may be harder to find if you're so personally close to the person?
Yeah, I mean, well, first was just actually logistics. I mean, the material was sort of scattered to the winds and on 8 different formats. So first it was actually finding the footage, and then the whole process of digitizing and transcribing all that, and then, you know, teaming up with HBO and getting all of those things moving. And then it was, once we were in it, it was, you know, notes, you know, looking at cuts, giving feedback, and having an outside perspective. But Rebecca worked really hard with the editor on sort of weaving it together, and then you take a step back, and then you're there for support when needed. But yeah, it was over the course of 8 years. So
you've been working on this for 8 years, and in the middle of that, you made another movie as well.
Yeah, Maggie's Plan. Yeah, we did do that. So it wasn't that I was cutting for 8 years, but it took years to just assemble the footage and digitize it and transcribe it and everything. And then we cut for 18 months. So it was a pretty long process getting this film together. Finding a structure for it was really hard, you know, and then deciding on the structure and then weaving it in and out, because it's not a typical documentary. It's sort of almost a personal essay. Sometimes we're between a personal essay and a documentary.
Right, we're often hearing from him at several different points in his life. There is a sort of thread of like sort of the first big play up until sort of the end of his life, but at the same time we are jumping back and forth a lot of the time and hearing sort of his thoughts about his life while he's older or younger and going back and forth.
A friend of mine recently described it as a cubist approach, like in terms of painting, like looking at something from different angles at the same time. And that's sort of how it was, like trying to get deep inside his head using letters and journal entries, but at the same time, and very personal footage. But then also there's the historical perspective, because you can't really tell his story without telling the story of his century a little. And so those eras are all definitely take a big chunk of the film as well.
One of the things that I love that he does, and what you do with him in the film, is demystify him a fair amount, because whenever someone is such a celebrated author or artist, as much as he is, we create big myths around them and about the work, and so often when he talks about his own work, it's very practical. It's very much about sitting down, writing, getting it done, rewriting, and figuring it out. Was that something that you sort of grew up with and helped you kind of figure out how to be an artist as well?
Yes, absolutely. He had a very workmanly approach to writing, and he also built furniture. And in a way, it was a similar kind of attitude of trying to build a thing that was just the sturdiest, and that included a story or a table. But people have said about this film, like anyone with a father can connect to this. It's sort of it's him as a father that's as important as him as a writer. And in a way, I think that seeing a writer as a human being is also important, because so often those two things are separated. And that's what I think I saw in terms of my impulse to even start shooting, was that he was so different in interviews as the great man, and then at home it was like not even the same person. I thought he's going to die and no one's going to know how funny he was.
Was that because he was sort of revered as this great man in interviews and he kind of liked to play with it a little bit?
I think he had become he was naturally shy, and I think he'd become somewhat defensive over the years.
One of the things that is so much fun to see in this is that at the height of his career, he was mythic. Someone says a giant of American theater. We don't really have those anymore. Like a playwright can't take on the kind of responsibility and celebrity that he took on. Did he ever talk about what that was like at the time?
He didn't talk about it so much because it was just normal everyday life in the countryside. But I think that at that time there was nothing more exciting than a great play, and the theater was at its height in terms of importance in the country, and also the voice of a great playwright was so important. So definitely he was a huge kind of star, I guess.
Yeah, he was a celebrity playwright, which is like a strange phrase to think of now. The only celebrity playwrights we have, I think, are also like fairly well-known actors as well. Your dad passed away, I think it was like in 2006, 2005?
2005, yeah.
So you've been working on this for about 8 years. Does it feel like you've kind of been living with him even since he's passed away by working on this documentary?
Well, I definitely feel like there was a kind of split between being the author and being the playwright, the child of the playwright, and being the filmmaker, and I had to keep skipping back and forth between those, because the filmmaker just needs to tell a good story in as economical and moving way as you can. And then the daughter is there reliving all these moments, and that can become very emotional. And that was really hard, and I had never experienced anything like that before. Also, I'm a really private person, so the idea that I never talk about myself in public, so it's very odd to be making a movie about something that I can't help it. I was making a movie about him, but it is, after all, my family home. It's my childhood, and I had to let that go.
How did you compartmentalize the two while you were making the film, the daughter versus the storyteller?
It's just an effort of will, I suppose, and because this is my 6th film. And also I had Damon and Cindy Tolan, who is also a producer, and of course our editor, David Bartner. And that was really, they really helped with that.
Yeah, Rebecca at first really tried to remove herself completely from the documentary, like no voiceover, didn't want to be really involved, just be involved as the director and the filmmaker, but not necessarily a character, but obviously she's part of the story. So, but even when it came to recording the voiceovers or things like that, it was done in a very, we edited the whole movie in our office, and like the voiceover work that was done was on her iPhone, so that it was finding out how to incorporate Rebecca and then the part she didn't want to be involved in, but finding that right balance. So.
And I needed a lot of sort of emotional support, as well as, just technical support from people, because it was such a delicate thing.
And you also don't necessarily use, as much as he's known, the great American playwright, you don't necessarily use the words from his plays to express who he is as a person. You use a lot of his unpublished writing, right? What prompted that?
Well, of course we do use some of the plays, but I find that when you watch plays filmed too long, doesn't have the power of watching it on theater. So I thought going into the journals, unpublished journals, and the actual letters was a way of getting behind the veil. Because my whole idea was like, the privilege I have was that I could get in there and really have you see inside of this person and see a personal portrait. And so I tried every angle I could, including, cinema verite, home movies, but also including these pieces of writing that were his private writings.
When you were shooting this 20 or so years ago, was it in the hopes of making a film at that time? I think you say this maybe in the film, and was your father expecting to be able to see a film about himself?
In the very beginning, I was really just shooting to have the footage that I would then pass on to someone else, I felt. You know, I didn't necessarily think I was going to finish a film. Once I started doing the more formal interviews, I thought, okay, maybe I'm really going to finish a film. And I suppose, it wasn't like he was holding his breath. I mean, he knew it was happening, and he figured I would finish it one day, but he had other concerns, you know.
There's a moment that I find so inspiring in the film, and your father's like fairly old at this point. I think it's this moment where he's building furniture, and you're asking him about what he's writing right now, and he says that he's writing a play, and in this period of time, his plays weren't getting the best of reviews, and you asked him sort of like why he's still doing it, and he said, because I like it. And I just thought that was so wonderful, because so often we talk about art, especially storytelling, as a means to be produced in some way. And we always think about the next step, and it didn't seem like he was ever really doing that. He was just writing to write.
He was writing to write, and he was always thinking that around the corner something was going to work. And often he was right. I mean, often the things that didn't work here worked in Europe, for example. And so he was filled with hope always that he was going to connect. And if he didn't connect with one play, he was going to connect with the next play. And he was sort of hoping for an audience always, but I think he defined himself essentially as a writer, which is why it's called Arthur Miller Writer, because that's really what he was in his essence.
Was there ever a moment where you thought of titling it Arthur Miller Playwright, or were you like, no, I want him to be writer overall, not just playwright?
I think
he has written novels. He's written lots of other stuff other than plays. Yes,
that's right. And then there's also that moment, I guess, you know, where he's interviewed, and we use it in the film, where they say, like, what would you like your obituary to say? And he just says one word. He says writer. And the guy says, like, could you elaborate? And he says, no, that's all. That's all I was going to say.
I love that moment, because that was another moment where it seemed like he knew his persona and was kind of playing with the interviewer a little bit as well. Like he was enjoying kind of like, yeah, writer, take that, get out of here.
Yeah, he knew how to dominate a situation.
When you were growing up with him, obviously you're a storyteller yourself and an artist. Did you share your work with him, or was that the kind of situation where he felt like a sort of huge force, you know, the great American playwright, and you didn't want to show it to him unless it was perfect?
No, I would show him my work, and he was helpful, but without ever being very specific. He would give he would say very general things. He might say one little thing. He was kind of he was not invasive in that way, but he was very supportive, and he loved the fact that I was writing, because I wrote fiction also. So.
Really? Mm-hmm. And he sort of let you find your own way. He knew that the writer had to find their way, and he wasn't going to be like, do this, do that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it. He knew that if I really was going to find a voice, it had to be my voice, and I would have to find it. And he also was smart enough to know that my voice was going to be nothing like his voice, because after all, you know, it was from
1948. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're not a post-war playwright, right? Trying to figure out the new America.
Right.
What do you think he would be writing about right now if he was a playwright right now? Do you think he would be focused on what's happening in the world and in America and be thinking in the same way? Because his plays, Death of a Salesman, all the boys, excuse me, or all my sons. Sorry, we're so focused on on kind of like the post-war America and what that felt like.
I think he would be tempted by satire at this point. You know, I think that he would.
I think the whole country is kind of.
And I think he would be probably trying to write about what's happening in some way and turn it, you know, but through some lens, you know, politically and morally, what's going on with this country. I mean, I think he would have tried to tackle it in his own way.
When you finished the film, what did that feel like? 8 years you had this, started shooting it 20 years ago. What was the moment when you realized, okay, we're done? Like, where were you, and how did you know that you were done?
I think it was Telluride. What do you think? What was that moment?
Yeah, Telluride was where it premiered, and that was the first time showing it to the public. And
were you guys like cutting up until that point?
We cut pretty closely to that point, and we sort of went back in just to do a few small tweaks. But I think it was Telluride because we were nervous that night. I mean,
I was very frightened. It was very strange to have it suddenly be exposed. I always have this feeling with films that when you have an audience, you're like, oh my God, I forgot strangers are going to see this. But this time, it was even that times 1,000, you know, that you realize, my God. And then, but also you realize, part of the journey of this film is I started putting it together so that my children would know their father, their grandfather, my father. And by the end of it, I felt, no, the reason I'm doing this is for all of you, like the people strangers. I mean, it's for them that this is, and because he really belongs to everybody as a playwright who gave his whole life to trying to communicate with people. And it's something that, you know, for all the audiences of the future, anyone who's interested in going back to his plays and seeing what he was like as a person.
You interview, I believe, your half-brother, I mean, some of your family members, but your half-brother in the film who has a very specific kind of relationship with your father as well. What did he end up how did he feel about the film when it was finished?
Yeah, Bob Miller, my brother, who also produced The Crucible, actually, the movie The Crucible.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's in the
yeah.
Film, yes.
He loved it. I think he felt it was fair, and it meant a lot to me that he and my sister Jane, you know, would see it as balanced in some way and relatively fair, and I think they really did. And I think his voice in the film is crucial, and really, I think he was so vulnerable and so generous.
Did you really explore that kind of that you had a much different childhood with him than Bob did? You know, he was a different kind of dedicated writer at the time that he was a father to Bob.
Yeah, and he was also creating himself and just in the process of this explosive kind of fame that was happening to him. And by the time he got to me, it was like everything was much more condensed. He was kind of at home in the country, hiding away from everybody rather than in the middle of everything. And it was a different, he was almost a different person, I would say.
Really? Did Bob notice that at the time as well? Like when Bob would come by when you were a kid, did you notice, would he talk about how he was a different person?
No. But that's my impression, and that's sort of what I think you get out of the film when you watch it. You sort of see him as a younger man and as an older man, and you see it as sort of transformation.
What do you hope people get out of seeing this? Say someone watches this in 10 years, 15, 20 years, has never read an Arthur Miller play, but sees this. What do you hope that they take from it?
Well, I would hope they would think, oh my God, I really want to go read these plays. I want to go see one of these plays, you know? And also for anybody who's endeavoring to do something that's difficult and that's risky, you know, they can look at that movie and think, you got to keep on, keep persevering, because it's as much about failure as it is about success. And, you know, a friend of mine who's an entrepreneur, actually, Zev, said that, you know, that for him it was inspiring as an entrepreneur. It doesn't have to be a writer, because it's about endeavor, right? It's about keeping going.
Yeah, I think anyone can relate to creating something, whether it's a play or a restaurant or a business or anything, and that failure and success and overcoming obstacles. And I think the film's also very relatable. Like, we had the premiere last night, and there were some people there that weren't too familiar with his work, and they were saying how much they related to the story of their own family or their own father, or, you know, there's a very human side to it. So it's not just, oh, you're obsessed with literature or plays that you're gonna love this. I think it's a very human story, and it's very relatable in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not like how to write a play or anything like that. It is
No, and
like
if you don't
plays
know
happen
his
to be-
plays at all, I think you're going to find his life really inspiring and what he went through and his sort of outlook on the world and any sort of success or career or, you know, how to get ahead. I think that's what's fascinating is the human side of it. And yes, academics will love it and people who love theater are going to love it, but if you don't know who he is at all, I think you could still be very connected to the material and the story.
Yeah,
people are
it's also
crying during the movie, which is not, unless it's a documentary about, you know, troubles in the world, you're not really, what's sad about a successful playwright, but there's this really emotional side to the film that I think people connect to.
Yeah, it's also a rags to riches, like, and then, you know, then the crash of 1929, his own father's story of you know, rising up and then from poverty, from complete poverty into a big business that then gets completely lost.
And it's a love story between like his different wives. Rebecca's mother is a really beautiful love story between Rebecca's mother and him, and you really get involved in that. And you love their relationship, and so it has a lot of facets to it.
Do you have a favorite play of your father's? I'm sure you get asked this every time you do a Q&A now.
Yeah, I don't really have a favorite play. I mean, they all have different effects on me. I guess Salesman is such an emotional play but I don't. It's hard to say it's my favorite play. So I guess I don't know.
And you talk about it in the film, but he wrote Salesman in like a very short period of time, right? It wasn't. I mean, the first act is one night, but was the whole thing one weekend?
No, the whole thing was 6 weeks. The second act took 6 weeks, but the first one was one night, and yeah, it just burned through him. But
He built a shed and then wrote in it, right?
yeah, he had the first 2 lines of the play going through his head. He built this little shed with his own hands. When he was done, he allowed himself to write the play. It was this sort of feeling like he had to build the shed before he could write the.
Love that story. Let's get some questions from our audience. Who has a question?
Hi. So, since there might not be some footage of your father that you might remember, you have memories of him that are not documented. Was there any thought to make this a narrative instead of a documentary?
I did never thought of making this a narrative. No, because I didn't think anyone could play him, really. I mean, he does such a good job of playing himself.
Next question right here.
Hi. So this is for both of you. Personally, what do you think is the hardest part of making a documentary?
My answer is going to be boring, but I mean, this is my first time producing a documentary, so I didn't know what was going on or how to put it together. So it's just a lot between all the materials and the footage that you're dealing with. You don't have a script or a format to go off of, so like they're finding that in the editing room, and the editors and Rebecca are very much writing it as they're going through the material. And then just on a logistics side, I mean, it's just like clearances are a nightmare. I know that's a very boring answer, but you know, everyone rights every photo or piece of footage, and it just adds up and up and up and up and up, and you end up with these huge bills that you have to deal with. So I know that's not boring, interesting to the viewer, but if you're a filmmaker, like the things I would say to be aware of would be like clearances and, you know,
Everybody owns an image. Every image is owned by somebody.
Yeah.
We were very lucky because a lot of the photographs in the film are actually my mother's photographs, so we were able to just get those for free. But yeah.
Yeah, and I think, you know, for this, it was because he is a successful playwright that had a good life. It's like, where's the heart of the story in this? What's the hardship? What's the emotion in it? How does it not turn into just some boring, dry, and then he did this, and then, you know, and Rebecca did that amazingly, and David Bartner, who's the editor, so.
The other thing is, for what we tried to do is we decided against that whole thing of having talking heads and a lot of famous people.
Yeah.
We had a couple of people, you know, Mike Nichols and Tony Kushner are helping stabilize it in a way, or kind of a little bit more rational, because a lot of it is more emotive, and a lot of it is just him and footage of him and all of the siblings talking and his children talking and so on.
And we didn't want it being like experts talking about, because that documentary can be made by anybody. I mean, what's unique about this is the insight Rebecca has, the personal, the home footage, the family and stuff. So you don't need a lot of talking experts talking about, you know, playwriting or whatever. Yeah, unless you're really into plays, I think that personally, everybody all right? It's not going to be that interesting to most people unless they're really into theater. And so it's like, where's the humanity? Where's the heart? How is this a human story? It doesn't matter if you're the most successful person or the least successful person. Everyone's human, and what is that line that connects everybody?
So I think really what the answer is, that challenge is the same challenge as when you're making a feature film, which is, why are people watching from moment to next? How do you draw people from one moment to the next? What's the mystery of character? What do you want to find out? How do you make things dramatic and not boring, but like keep like the pace is like quick 1 minute, and then you get to kind of let it flow a little bit. It's a lot of the same problems, excepting you don't have a script, so it's terrifying.
And your interview with Mike Nichols is really beautiful. He has this deep well of emotion for your father's plays. He cries just talking about them. Were you surprised by that? Did you expect him to just weep while talking about Death of a Salesman?
No, I really didn't. I mean, he was so vulnerable at that time as well, because it was sort of like, I think his last interview, actually. But he did have such a deep connection, because he went to the first production when he was a teenager. He went to the Lee J. Cobb production. So, and then he went and he directed it, and he directed Phil Seymour Hoffman in it. And then that was the last thing that Phil did. So it was just surrounded by this whole nimbus of emotion.
And we're working on having more of that interview and the Tony Kushner interview on the HBO special features or extras or whatever.
Right, along with some of Arthur's stories. Like, because one of the things I had wanted to include in the film, but there just wasn't room, was some of the stories that he would have, these cycles of stories that he would tell at the dinner table at parties all the time. And so I wanted to include some of those, and we have like 3 or 4 of those up as well.
Oh, great. They'll be on like the HBO Go website? Or
Yeah, like on
film?
the extras, or we're still figuring out where exactly, but.
Can't wait. I think we have time for one more question.
Hey guys,
You.
So I was wondering, what was the best piece of advice that both of you received throughout your life?
Specifically from Arthur Miller, or in general?
Just in general.
just
Let's
in
narrow
gener-
it.
Well,
We'll narrow it to
I'll,
Arthur for you, and
well, I'll, since she's sitting next to me. Well, I started as Rebecca's assistant on this movie, The Private Lives of Pippa Lee, and
great movie.
Yeah, it's a great movie. You should check it out. And I wanted to start creating my own work at some point, and sort of jump off the cliff. And I was and hearing Rebecca's stories, and then hearing her talk about her father's failures and stuff. There's always this fear. Oh God, you want to get it perfectly the first time. And I remember I was interested in writing, and Rebecca was just like, if you want to write, you just got to write. And I was like, what if what do people say? And she just said, you got to have bigger balls than that. And I just thought, fair enough. And then I ended up waiting tables for 5 years and creating my own work. And then we sort of hooked back up and started a production company. But if I didn't have bigger balls, then I wouldn't have ever, I would have kept on assisting, and I would have kept on, I wouldn't have followed what I really wanted to do, so. Got big balls.
I think, yeah, you did such a good
your
job.
advice
Such
too?
a good job,
Yeah.
yeah, for that. Well, no, my dad, I think that there's something that he says in the film, which is kind of great advice, which is, I asked him about what it was, there was a period where he had a lot of failures in the theater, and he said, I never blame other people because it isn't true. But if you're gonna quit writing, it's one thing. If you're gonna keep going, the important thing is the voice, and that you don't go silent. And that the idea is that you just, whatever other people think of your work, you might have great moments where everyone think you've done something great, and moments where people don't think that what you've done is great, or where it's mixed or whatever, and you have to listen to your own voice and be true to your own voice. And that, I think, is good advice for everybody.
On that note, when can people watch Arthur Miller Writer?
On the 19th of March at
I think it's 8 p.m.
8 p.m.
8 p.m.
8 p.m. on
Super
HBO, yeah.
I love the film. Congratulations. Thank you so much for being here. Everybody give it up for Rebecca.
Thank you so much.
Tara.
Thank you.